I mean, tonight and the next couple of weeks, I thought we should look at this idea of Christian nationalism, or the relationship between Christianity and the state, because, here's Neil, I mean, not just because of the coronation, but you know, that kind of gives a bit of a stimulus to it. I mean, the kind of questions that are around, you know, about the traditions and nature of the British state, but I think wider issues as well. I mean, I think there's a real danger for liberal Christians, for want of a better term, or progressive Christians, or people in our kind of wing of the theological spectrum, let's put it that way, to kind of overlook and ignore the kind of what seem to be quite extreme kind of views, but they are very prevalent, and they are more prevalent than we sometimes give them credit, and they have real influence on global politics and the world politics. So I just put together a few slides as a sort of introduction for the first part of our discussion. So looking at the connection between the Christian faith and the British state as we have it, and then look at just a couple of little passages from Ezra to see if there's anything there which kind of resonates, or how we can interact with a particular perspective from the Old Testament, which is, I think, to a large extent, to a certain extent anyway, a minority perspective within the Old Testament, about the relationship of Israel and the exclusivity of Israel. But we can look at that a bit later. But let's just start by contextualizing ourselves. And I mean, I saw this today in the Guardian feed, and I thought I'd just put it was in, you know, in that Guardian Live column, and I just put this: the Russian President Vladimir Putin has decided to hand over the historic 15th century Trinity icon to the museums of the Russian Orthodox Church because of its importance to believers, the Kremlin spokesman has said. The church, whose conservatism Putin has espoused as part of his vision for Russia's national identity, is one of the most ardent institutional supporters of Russia's war in Ukraine. Its head, Patriarch Kirill, has urged Russians to rally behind Moscow's military campaign in Ukraine. Said last year that those who died fighting in Ukraine will be purged of their sins. I mean, it just leapt out of the Guardian website to me, and as I said at the beginning, it just feels like we can overlook this interconnection between what is fascism and Christianity, but it is, you know, Trumpism. It's there in the evangelical Christianity in America. It's there with Orban in Hungary, and so on. And we just need to be very cognizant of that. What I've done is put together some statements by political leaders in the UK, and I'll go through them one by one, and then we can reflect on them together as to what they say about the leadership of the UK and its relationship to Christianity. And you might find some surprising things in it, but it'd be quite interesting. I read a book whose name I've forgotten, just gave me the idea for this. Here's the first one from David Cameron. I believe the big society is nothing less than the reshaping of the state and society around the people. It's about liberation, the biggest, most dramatic redistribution of power from elites in Whitehall to the man or woman on the street. That's why I call it the big society. It's about a culture change in our country today. That's why I believe it is so desperate desperately needed. And here's my radical proposition. We're going to help build the big society from the bottom up. So let us build that big society in the name of the King, who taught us to love our neighbours as ourselves. And the King is Jesus. So that's maybe a surprising starting point.
Wow.
And then we go to the Vicar's Daughter and some quotes from Theresa May. Faith is a powerful force for good in our communities. Christianity has an important role to play in making Britain a country that works for everyone. My faith is important to me. It's part of who I am and therefore how I approach things. I do go to church, which she does, and I find it a source of solace and support. Boris Johnson, and this is, I think, the most honest of all of the replies. Catholic school as a child gave him a deep sense of the mystery of existence and an appreciation for the moral teachings of Jesus Christ. He also expressed his belief in the importance of forgiveness, charity, and humility. Christianity is the most incredible cultural force there is, and praises its contribution to the development of democracy, the rule of law, and individual freedom. Then he said, he is a very, very bad Christian who struggles to reconcile his faith with his own moral failings and mistakes. That's Boris Johnson.
Disagree with that.
This is honest here. And then Jeremy Corbyn, who's interestingly really looks back a lot to the sort of 17th century Puritans. And I believe in the principles of Christianity in terms of the way in which we should live our lives. I've read the Bible a lot, and I think it's a very good guide to how we should live our lives. When asked if he believed that Jesus was the Son of God, Corbyn said, no, I believe he was a prophet, a teacher, and a very good one. And then Tony Blair, he describes his faith as a great guiding principle in his life. Faith is not a problem for politics. It is at its best a vital source of purpose, hope, and inspiration. The solution to religious conflict is not to reject faith, but to seek dialogue and understanding between people of different faiths and none. Secularism is not a neutral space. It has its own set of values and beliefs, and we need to be aware of what they are. Okay, Gordon Brown. See, with two children of clergy in previous prime ministers, and there were others, of course. What's his name? David Steele, who previously was the son of the Manse. There's a Labour cabinet minister as well, who was the son of a Manse. Anyway, I believe that faith is a journey, and like all journeys, it can be testing and tough, but the rewards are immense. The rewards of a life that is not self-centered, but that seeks to serve others. The reward of a life that is not obsessed with material gain, and that understands the true meaning of wealth. For me, Christianity is about compassion, about reaching out to help those less fortunate than ourselves, about recognizing that we're all equal in the eyes of God, and that each individual life is precious. Now, Ed Miliband, rather. I'm Jewish and I'm an atheist, and I think that there are lots of Jews like that. I have a cultural connection, I have a family connection. That's why I feel part of the Jewish community. But I'm not religious in the slightest. I think it's important to have a sense of morality, a sense of right and wrong, and I think that comes from lots of places. For me, my upbringing, my parents, my grandparents, my cultural heritage, my religion, in a sense, all of those things contribute to my sense of right and wrong. Values that I hold dear, social justice, equality, tolerance, are the values that underpin Judaism. They're also the values that I believe should underpin our politics. And then Rishi Sunak. My parents are Hindu, and I grew up with that, so it's part of my identity. It's definitely important to me. But I don't think I'm unusual in that. I think most people in this country have some connection to a faith or religious institution, whether it's through family or upbringing. He went on to explain that his faith informs his belief in the importance of hard work and personal responsibility, as well as his commitment to giving back to his community. He said Hinduism has a strong tradition of service, of giving back to society. I think that's something that stayed with me, part of the reason why I went into public service, to try to make a difference and contribute to the common good.
Wow.
I think it's really interesting to put all those together. And one more. Of course, the King. I believe in the importance of maintaining the religious and cultural diversity that sustains society and the values of mutual respect and understanding that enable it to do so. For me, the Christian faith is about hope. It is about trusting in God's purpose for our lives, regardless of our circumstances. It is about following the example of Jesus and loving our neighbour. I've always believed that we need to work to build bridges between different faith traditions, to appreciate and respect the ways in which others seek to give expression to their relationship with God. The central purpose of faith is to remind us that we are not the centre of the universe, says he wearing a crown in the orb. So I mean, I just I just wondered if I just put those together, and because I'd read this book, sorry, cults, myths, and something or other about recent faith and recent history, and that book had looked at these political leaders. So I pulled these together, and I just wondered, what does it tell us about the genuine place of Christianity in the mindset of people who actually are leaders, and are either elected or inherited leaders, of the country, and does that faith that they express in that very personal kind of way, does it really impact on public policy? Does it change public policy and perception? Has it? And if so, how and why? And is there actually any kind of theology that underlies the British state, or is it actually just a secular institution with sort of a kind of sprinkling of religious language when it seems to be appropriate? I don't know. What do you think?
I was struck when you read the quote from Theresa May that this is the woman who had a bus or van painted telling us all that this was a hostile environment for asylum seekers and refugees, and thinking, where does that come from Christianity? So I sort of very skeptical of these people who talk about how important their faith is to them and then behave like that, in just the same way that Suella Braverman's supposed to be a practicing Buddhist, and yet she comes out with the most horrendous rhetoric. And you think, well, how can you show yourself in church or in the Buddhist meeting on a Sunday or whenever, and then come out with this stuff? It just doesn't make sense. I can't understand it at all.
It's a disconnect, isn't it?
Yeah, a real disconnect.
I mean, sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say, been reading The Cost of Discipleship recently.
Oh gosh.
There are two words that sum it up: cheap grace.
Yes. 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 Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Maybe.
I mean, I think that they are all different. I mean, I think David Cameron is the shallowest, probably, and Boris Johnson is, I mean, he's just a rogue, and he knows what to say, and then he says, "Well, I don't do it anyway, so who cares?" In that book I was reading, I mean, I think they quoted Jeremy Corbyn as being the person who was actually, although quite clearly not a Christian, the person who draws most upon the gospel and the Bible. And then Tony Blair, I mean, again, you've got somebody who is actually quite a thinker, but he also is responsible for the Iraq War. And the death of millions, in that. This man, I believe.
Yes, I do.
And I think you can tell in his actions that his concern for poverty, for what he's gone on to do since leaving the role of Prime Minister, that there's something genuine about his engagement. and these are interesting, and people of other faiths, you know, I mean, I think that's again, you can see how Judaism would inform the Miliband family, even though they're not practicing. This I don't know. I don't know. And the king? You know?
As you say, if the central purpose of faith is to remind us we're not the center of the universe, why is he sitting there with a crown and orb and on a throne? As if he is the center of the universe, that sort of doesn't quite make sense.
No, no.
And even if he genuinely believes that, it's the symbolism of the whole regalia is actually contradicting it. So it's either a struggle within him or he just doesn't realize it, but it's giving out completely the opposite message.
And he had the option of not doing the anointing and, you know, all of that. I mean, he didn't have to do that, but he wanted to do it. I think he's a very conservative Christian.
Yes.
I was just thinking back to when the Queen's funeral happened and that very strange moment of breaking the wand. It's something rather weird and occultic about that, I felt. And it does, I don't know, maybe I don't want to go into conspiracy theories or whatever, but it just smacks to me of powers that are hidden behind the throne, that are not openly expressed in terms of faith, but are in some form faith-based. And I think that's very dangerous. Whether there's a real spiritual element to them or not is almost irrelevant. It's the fact that they're hidden gives them power. And I really found that a very uncomfortable moment in the funeral.
And that moment, they also took the crown and the orb and the scepter from the coffin and put them on the altar.
Yes.
Symbolizing that, you know, her power had come from God and was therefore returned to God. The symbols of the state were actually divinely given, and that interrelationship. I mean, I kind of, from what I pick up from this, it feels like you've actually got a structure of a state which is rooted in a medieval theology, which is kind of rooted in a distorted view of kingship from the Old Testament. And then you've got a kind of liberal washing of Christianity. Christianity is about doing good. It's about the Good Samaritan. It's about being nice to your neighbour and community cohesion, and churches running playgroups and food banks, and, you know, big society kind of stuff, but not the kind of liberative Christianity which is about freeing the oppressed and letting the prisoners go free, and, you know, the blind see, and, you know, all of that.
Well, I mean, arguably, and I don't know if I totally adhere to this theory, but churches running things like food banks and so on actually just perpetuate the oppression of the state. You know, it's a viewpoint I've heard expressed, and it's an interesting one.
I think it is very interesting, because I think it goes back to this fella.
Exactly.
And his notion of the big society, and that, you know, in the name of the King who taught us to love our neighbours as ourselves, this big society idea is just hand over everything to the church, you know, and what they've done is gradually dismantle the welfare state and push it onto two groups. One is the charity sector, the church and the charity sector, and the mosques and the temples as well, the gurdwaras, and the other side to the private sector, for profit. So it's they've dismantled what was the post-war welfare settlement and made it both private and non-governmental, yeah,
Mm.
and for profit and not for profit.
Mm.
So that question is, are we a Christian country? I think is nominally, culturally, but from the perspective of Christianity, I mean, from the vantage point of a more liberative understanding of Christianity, it's open to a lot of challenge.
Yeah.
Your third question, Vaughan, I'm increasingly wondering whether nationalism itself has become a religion. Because one way of looking at the coronation, for example, is that there you have nationalism as a religion, and the established church is colluding in that and encouraging that. And very tellingly, I mean, if anybody's interested, the books by a historian called Carlton Hayes, who first suggested that in the 1920s. But one of the examples he gives is if you go into something like Westminster Abbey or the equivalent in the States, all the plaques are about national heroes. There are very few plaques about Christian heroes. They're national heroes. So that actually becomes a shrine of nationalism as a religion.
Yes.
And that sort of makes sense of a lot of what's going on here, because people are sort of really worshipping themselves or the nation rather than anything beyond that. And it's the nation that's seen as the sacred thing that's called by God to have a king. And so I think for me, there's quite a lot to be said in that actually that's where it's all gone wrong.
Yes. I remember sorry, I was just going to say, I remember even as a child puzzling over why there was a plaque to Nelson in, I think, Westminster Abbey. And he'd never exhibited anything of Christian values in his life.
Exactly.
But had been shot in a battle.
Yes.
But I think that was the genius of Michael Mann when he was Dean of Westminster, to have those statues of the 20th century martyrs above the. Do you know that?
Yes.
The west door.
Oh right, yes, I did hear about that.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, it's got Martin Luther King, it's got Bonhoeffer, it's got I can't remember about all of them, but there's the 6 men and women from the 5 continents. Really interesting.
Yeah.
Subversive thing in a way.
Yes.
Just a way to subvert. I did that a long time ago. There was a massacre of Namibians in Angola in a place called Kasinga, and the South African Army Air Force had come and bombed the refugee camp, and it was mostly women and children, and a lot were killed. So I organised a service of remembrance there, and Westminster Abbey let us use the King Somebody chapel at the back, at the very back, a beautiful 15th century chapel, and they allowed us to use that. And in that, you've got all of the kind of flags of the kings of the UK, and it was a place where kings were buried, and it just felt incredibly fantastic to remember those people who were just hadn't been, their massacre hadn't been discovered for days, and just to remember them in that place. The juxtaposition of the two things felt just really, really incredible. I don't know why I say that, but so anyway, the theology underlying the British state, I think, it's a very weak theology. It's a theology which is based on an outmoded view of God and the relationship between God and sovereign, and it's about a very liberal, weak understanding of Christian ethics. A very kind of.
Can I just challenge that a little bit? Because I don't think it is weak. I think it's very strong in its own way, but it's not Christian.
Okay.
I think there's a great strength in the way that the state continues to perpetuate its safe version of Christianity. it sort of makes me think it's almost like Caiaphas in a sense, in that, you know, if Jesus had just kept a little bit quieter and just been a little bit more obedient to the Roman authorities and to the priests in the temple, then that would have been all right. You know, he could have carried on, and it pretty much Caiaphas says that he's frustrated by this guy. Why'd you have to be so noisy? Just shut up.
Yeah.
But then you can carry on doing your thing. It's all right. You can have a bit of power. And I think that that's a really strong theology in this country, that there's so far you can go, but just don't go any further than that. And you often hear it in a sense of, well, my faith is personal. What does that mean? How is that faith? If it's personal, what's the point?
Yeah. Very interesting. And also, I mean, you know, Justin Welby is a lovely man.
Yeah.
When he's being interviewed about putting the crown on the king's head and how is he nervous and, you know, all of that stuff, and he's the he's the devil incarnate when he talks in the House of Lords against the illegal migration bill, you know, and criticizes the government very powerfully.
I thought that was a really profound moment, and it's a shame it hasn't been noticed more, because the media was really stirred up about it. I thought for once in the right way. Going, you know, how can you say that this guy's all right on Saturday, and then on Wednesday, oh no, he's not, he's terrible? Yes, makes no sense. And you know, for once, the media picked up on something, which was it was a moment of revelation. I think if people had taken it, some people did, I think.
Okay. Well, let's just move on a bit, because I wanted to look at what is national conservatism, because this is very contemporary today. There's this conference going on, and this national conservatism, you know, there seems to be this kind of commitment to the state, the rule of law, Christianity as a public religion. Big thing about the traditional family, men are men, women are women, and restrictive policies on immigration, you know, and it's not a new phenomenon. You know, we've got, you know, Germany in the 1930s and 40s, and Putin, and we just talked about that now, and the evangelicals in America at the moment, and this conference that's on in London now, that's being reported, I mean, national conservatism they define as, you know, tradition of independent, self-governing nations as the foundation for restoring public orientation towards patriotism and courage, honor and loyalty, religion and wisdom, congregation and family, man and woman, Sabbath and the sacred, reason and justice, freedom, security, prosperity. You know. And that's a very distinctive theological position. That it's an unbending theology, if you like.
Sorry, I can't stay quiet on that one. That's terrible. You look at those pairings; they're awful. You know, religion just ends up being a little bit wise. Okay, it sits in the corner, and it nods its head and says nice things, and then it shuts up. But it doesn't go out and fight. There's no courage in religion. We don't do that.
But it does police sex. It polices sex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's awful, isn't it? I did notice from the pictures, because there was the interruption, wasn't there, with Suella Braverman, and it's interesting, the camera swept across the audience. Absolutely no people of colour.
That's interesting.
And mostly, I'd say 80% men.
Yeah.
And actually, frighteningly, mostly men, I'd say, in their 20s and 30s.
Yeah. Yes.
That's frightening.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That was said, that you'd expect it to be a sort of an elderly, you know, but in fact it wasn't. It was a youthful audience, and that it was attracting that kind of. It was attracting younger people.
I'm just furious about religion being wise. I refuse to do that. I don't want to be wisdom. Stuff that one.
At least one clergyman speaking there, and certainly an academic theologian from Cambridge, Oxford, Oxford or Cambridge. I noticed. I had a look through the list and thought,
oh, not Calvin Robinson.
No, this was guy. James Orr.
James Orr.
Oh gosh, yes. Yeah.
Well, I've not come across before, but I looked up his credentials and I think, oh dear.
Yeah. You won't get very far in any one of his books, I guarantee you.
It didn't look as if I would, actually. It didn't look very appealing. But it just is worrying, really. You've got these people sort of coming up with this stuff.
And just to finish up this bit, you know, I mean, this is Orban. He was talking at some conference in Texas. Condemns immigration, globalization, gender fluidity.
Yeah.
This is a culture war. We have to revitalize our churches, our families, our universities, our institutions. And you've got the same stuff going on with Trump, Bolsonaro in Brazil, though he's gone. But you know, we had a film the other night, which was oh, you were there, weren't you, Neil? Yeah. And you know, the people praying there while they were illegally logging, and Russia and Putin, we've mentioned that. This I think is a really interesting quote, just to finish off this, from somebody called Martin Whittock, who is a historian, an evangelical historian, wrote an article in that Premier Christianity, you know, journal. And I think I just think he's hit the nail on the head, because obviously coming from an evangelical Christian background. Question facing socially conservative Christians is how high a level of damage are they willing to accept regarding democratic norms, rules of law, treatment of minorities and immigrants, conflict between nations, in order to assert what they consider to be Christian social and cultural models in societies which, in large part, do not subscribe either to the Christian faith or to these norms. That's a really stunning question.
Do you mind if I take a picture of that quote?
No, it's good.
There was a very good film on, I don't know, Harley's probably seen it, and I just got around to seeing it recently, but it was on Sunday, called The Mauritanian, about Guantanamo Bay, and a detainee who was taken there and for 16 years. It's a very well made film. Benedict Cumberbatch played the lawyer who was supposed to prosecute, but in the end refused because of his Christian principles. And that basically brought the case down, you know, largely because if he had, then I think it probably would have carried on. But that was a moment, and it's just thinking of what you said here, because the amount of torture this guy went through for America to try and defend itself and to defend its Christianity, which was constantly purported by people around the detainees in Guantanamo Bay. You know, you think, well, what are you defending now? What's left?
It's a good film. I've seen it.
Horror. You know, it's a good film. It's worth watching.
I have seen it. Yeah.
What's it called again?
It's called The Mauritanian.
Thank you.
So it will be on iPlayer now, Harley.
Thanks.
So, I mean, all of that stuff is, I mean, it's incredibly topical. It's incredibly relevant, and it's actually big stuff when you think, you know, that you could end up with another Trump presidency. You could have Putin in there. You could have Orban. You know, I mean, it could be, and you know, stuff going on, you know, in France and Italy as well. I mean, it's by no means a dead issue, and you don't really hear a counter theological argument being made against it. You know, I mean, it's just assumed, I think, by the general population that Christianity is either that stuff that we saw from the prime ministers, you know, or it's this hard right stuff. And you don't hear anywhere that actually Christianity is about disturbing the order of oppressive orders of society and creation. Would you like to have a look at some of the couple of passages, very short passages from Ezra, just to see? Sorry, Graham.
Yeah, I mean, what this sort of moment in history reminds me of is actually the situation in Germany in the 30s when the Nazis were you know, and if you read Bonhoeffer in particular, and also Karl Barth, they were absolutely clear on what was happening, and you know that some people, you know, people in Germany had turned Christianity into an idolatrous faith in something or other. And I find it, you know, the mood in this country at the moment to be a bit chilling on those lines.
Yeah. And they had to do something about it, you know. I mean, Bonhoeffer and Barth had to think through a response. You know, it wasn't just, I mean, it was also action that they took, but it also thought it through. I mean, as you say, I mean, Barth, you know, and others, you know, Niemöller, you know, they were people who thought theologically about what was going on, and not just in terms of activism, although activism was a response.
Yeah, and I think they had to do so in a context where the German, you know, the German society was very socially conservative.
Right.
And the Lutheran Church was tremendously socially conservative. And to actually, you know, say something against it and pronounce these really very radical things, I think it's, you know, it was
yeah, that's true.
And
Go on.
Interestingly, of course, Hitler traded in nostalgia, just like this lot do.
Yep.
Because that's why they had this idea of deviant art, because the only really good art was the art pre-Weimar, which would have been pre-First World War, where it was all sort of big country cottages and things like that. And it was a looking back to an idealized past. And that's what I started trying to do. But an idealized past that didn't actually exist.
Okay, I just chose two very short passages from Ezra. The first one is from chapter 6, and you know Ezra himself appears in chapter 7. And so the first lot of people come from Babylon and come back and have a go at rebuilding the temple, and they don't succeed. And then they have another go when Ezra appears. But the first one, this little passage, you know, just towards the end of chapter 6 appears. The Passover celebrated. On the 14th day of the first month, the returned exiles kept the Passover. Both the priests and the Levites had purified themselves. What?
Frozen for me.
Can you see? Oh, everything's frozen.
Yeah.
Oh, Peter moved. Can you hear me?
Or, I mean, I can hear you because you're in the room. Couldn't hear you through the system. Oh, everyone's back.
We're back.
We're all back.
Right. Yes.
There you go.
That was strange.
Okay. Okay. The Passover celebrated. So yeah, they've come back, and then on the 14th day of the first month, the returned exiles kept the Passover. So both the priests and the Levites had purified themselves. All of them were clean. So they killed the Passover lamb for all the returned exiles, for their fellow priests and for themselves. It was eaten by the people of Israel who returned from exile, and also by all who had joined them and separated themselves from the pollutions of the nations of the land to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. With joy they celebrated the feast of unleavened bread for 7 days, for the Lord had made them joyful and had turned the heart of the king of Assyria to them, so that he aided them in the work on the house of God, the God of Israel. I mean, why this passage is interesting is something about the Passover itself as being marking very significant moments in Israel's history. So the Exodus itself is what the Passover commemorates, but the Passover was first initiated on the completion of the tabernacle, you know, in the wilderness. And then it was celebrated again, if you remember, Joshua on the entry into the Promised Land. It's revived and celebrated through at Josiah's reform, and now it's being celebrated again, initiated again, on the return of the exiles from Babylon. So the Passover, the ritual of the Passover, becomes something that marks the cultural and religious identity, and the history of the people. And there, if you see in verse 21, it was eaten by the people of Israel who returned from exile, and also by those who joined them and separated themselves from the pollutions of the nations of the land. So there's something about this religious celebration being also about defining the community and the purity of the community. So only certain people are allowed to participate in this feast. I mean, there's lots of parallels and stuff going on. We don't need to go into that between the way in which the Passover has been celebrated and all those kind of key historic moments. But I just wanted to look in this one about the identity of the people and what makes a people, what gives the people, what gave the people of Israel their identity. And then the second one comes from chapter 10, which is when Ezra discovers that when he comes back with all the returned exile, he discovers that people have intermarried, and the Assyrians have brought people from other tribes into the land, and the people are no longer ethnically pure in that sense. And while Ezra prayed and made confessions, weeping and throwing himself down before the house of God, a very great assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him out of Israel. The people also wept bitterly. Shekinah, son of Jehiel of the descendants of Elam, addressed Ezra, saying, "We have broken faith with our God and have married foreign women from the peoples of the land. But even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. So let us make a covenant with our God to send away all these wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord, and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law. Take action, for it is for your duty, and we are with you. Be strong and do it." And Ezra stood up and made the leading priests and Levites and all Israel swear that they must do as had been said, so they swore. I mean, that to me goes alongside Peter's list of bad things in the Old Testament. I mean, it's a kind of horrific moment, and is a counter. I mean, other parts of the scriptures, from that period, I don't know, try to Isaiah, Esther, Ruth, Chronicles, they're much more inclusive and more integrationist, but this is really exclusive, and you wonder whether the dynamic within this is parallel to the kind of dynamic that you hear in the earlier stuff we've been talking about, or whether there's something in this which we're missing and should see as being helpful. What gives identity to a people, I think?
I mean, it certainly makes sense in terms of some of the Old Testament, where there is this concern with ethnic purity and more importantly, religious purity that they're really concerned about here. But sorting it out takes the form of sort of an ethnic decision. But it's horrendous, isn't it? It's a passage I was vaguely aware of, but had forgotten about. And yeah, I need to get in touch with someone who can explore this passage a bit further. So it's given me like but it's the trouble is, it's the sort of thing people can read and think, it's there in the Bible, and it's got divine.
Yeah.
But
I mean, the notion of a nation state is irrelevant to this. it's a complete anachronism. I mean,
Yes.
that they weren't thinking in those terms because that wasn't how things were organized. But you can almost see with the Passover a religious ceremony which binds people together and gives people a sense of a communal identity, which we do on a Sunday morning. You know, we'll have communion, and you know, we will invite people in, and lots of churches will be very clear about who can take communion and who cannot, and you need to be baptized and so on. Some of us might be a bit more open about that, but nevertheless, I mean, you can see that putting some kind of ritual around a community is not necessarily in itself a bad thing. But when it starts to exclude to the degree that you get in chapter 10, where people who are married and have responsibilities and have children and they cut them off, then that moves into the area of cult-like behavior, I think. I don't know. Do you find it shocking?
And even though it's done for religious reasons, that doesn't mean that people aren't going to read it today and do it for other reasons. Because basically it's us and them, and they have got to go, so we remain pure. It's like British National Party rhetoric, isn't it? Really, about keeping the British genes pure. It's horrendous.
What strikes me is you define yourself by what you're not rather than what you are. So it's like a donut. It's emptiness in the middle, but there's a ring around it to protect the emptiness. You know, and you find this with the right, don't you? They know what they don't want to be, but they have no policies for what they do want, or they don't work. So where is the right as far as climate change is concerned? You know, it's not a choice. You've got to have something to say about it. So it's, and I feel that a little bit here. You know, and you mentioned the BNP. I should think a lot of people in the BNP have very little in common with each other, but at least they know what they're not.
Yes.
So they can go kick.
You see, I find the first part, the Passover thing, much more palatable than the second. I mean, because the Passover is a story of liberation, and as I said, in the Old Testament, it kind of marks these very significant moments of the people discovering the freedom of God, the liberty of God. I mean, that's very good, and it's almost like. And so should be celebrated, and you would want to say to people, yes, own your history, know what it was, know that God has protected you, have these little ceremonies which remind you. But it's rather like people who commemorate the Second World War and use it as a moment of history of hatred of Germans rather than a reconciliation moment of reconciliation or recognition that you shouldn't do that ever again. You wouldn't want that ever to happen again. It's almost as if you own the triumph of your history and make it then something that offsets against the other and puts you apart from the other. If that makes sense.
But the two passages actually contradict each other, because in the first one, it talks about the people of Israel who had returned from exile, and also by who had joined them and joined in to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. But then suddenly in chapter 10, you're sending away all those people who've joined you. And you got married. It doesn't make any reference to whether they worship the God of Israel or not, but irrespective of that, because they're not Jews, they're chucked out, and that's so suddenly from being very inclusive, it becomes exclusive, and makes me want to read what comes in between to make them change their mind.
Yeah, what comes out.
I need to go in a minute. I'm afraid I do.
Right. Oh yes, I know you said. Yeah. next week I thought we'd look at the influence of this on patriarchy and look at the impact, how Christian nationalism is reinforcing those kind of relationships between genders, and how it and look at the story of the Canaanite woman who talks and challenges Jesus